We'll get started. Welcome everyone and good morning. I'm Carla Barger, co-director of the Digital Humanities Initiative here at UIC. And before we get started, I want to let everyone know that this event is being recorded. Welcome to our Fall 2020 workshop, Getting Started in Digital Humanities, hosted by the Digital Humanities Initiative at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The DHI at UIC was initially funded by University of Illinois Presidential Grant to celebrate the impact of the arts and the humanities, and is a collaboration between the Institute for the Humanities and the University Library. The DHI hosts events throughout the year, including workshops like this one, and our upcoming conference on October 22nd and 23rd, Resources and Visibility in Digital Humanities. Registration for that conference is open, and you can find it by visiting our website at dhi.uic.edu. So before I talk a little bit about our program today, I'd like to introduce the other co-director of the DHI, Janet Swacchino, who will be moderating two of today's sessions. Janet?
Thanks, Carla. So first, I just want to say how excited I am to see everyone's presentations today because I was so impressed with the tutorials I got to watch ahead of time. I'm the digital publishing librarian here at the UIC Library, and like Carla said, the co-director of the Digital Humanities Initiative. And I just want to quickly plug a service that the UIC Library offers to faculty and students and staff at UIC called Digital UIC. So later in the day, we're going to hear from Kelly O'Neill, who created a really excellent tutorial on how she used multiple platforms, including Scalar and Omeka, to create an interactive multimedia project. So if her tutorial is of interest to you and these platforms sound like something you'd want to try out, Digital UIC will give you access to both Scalar and Omeka. I'm happy to talk to individuals too about getting access and getting started learning about them. So you can sign up if you have a NetID and password at digital.uic.edu. Thanks.
Thanks, Janet. Okay, we're very excited about the outstanding presenters who have and are graciously giving us their time and the equally outstanding tutorials they created for this event. Again, presenters, thank you. Whether you're here to learn about developing your first project, or archival methodology, or natural language processing techniques, or digital storytelling, or multilingual content management, or the myriad of digital tools available to you and how to use them, we know that all of you, whether you're a new digital humanist or a more experienced one, will leave this event armed with the knowledge you need to start or continue your DH projects. Today's format is designed specifically for the demands of the COVID-19 moment. It is experimental, mindful of the lassitude of virtual life for both audience and presenter, and, much like learning to live and thrive during a plague, new to us. It's based on and was adapted from a hybrid model developed by our friends at the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria, Canada, who we heartily thank for their innovative thinking. The pre-recorded tutorials for each session became available upon registration beginning 1 week ago today. Our workshop presenters will now summarize the main points of their pre-recorded tutorial for 5 to 10 minutes, and then answer questions for an additional 10 to 15 minutes. Please enter your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat, and the moderator, either Janet or I, will present as many as we can to each workshop leader during the allotted time for the Q&A. At the risk of stating the obvious, we will only read questions relevant to the tutorial being presented at the time, so please time your questions accordingly. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Janet, who will moderate our first session, Emerging Genres and Methods.
Great. So this first session is focused on emerging genres and methods. And the first tutorial in the session is titled US Latinx Archival Methodology. And our presenters are the US Latino Digital Humanities Program Team. The US LDH team is Gabriela Baeza Ventura, Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of Houston. She is also the Executive Editor of Arto Publico Press and co-founder of US LDH. Carolina Villarroel, who is the Brown Foundation Director of Research, recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Program at the University of Houston and co-founder of the U.S. LDH. Linda Garcia Merchant is a postdoctoral fellow for US LDH, and Lorena Gattero, Digital Programs Manager at the University of Houston. The second presentation in this session is From Words to Networks, Text-Based Semantic Network Analysis by a team of 4 colleagues from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Jana Deisner is an associate professor at the iSchool at UIUC. Julian Chin is a research manager at the iSchool. Janina Sarol is a PhD student in informatics, and Lang Cheng is a PhD student in information sciences. And then the final presentation to round out this session is Digital Storytelling on the Border from Mary Kate Coleman. Mary Kate is a PhD student here at UIC and an investigator for the Humanizing Deportation project and a Fulbright US student researcher. So now I'm going to turn it over to the US LDH team.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be part of the fall 2020 virtual workshop, getting started in the digital humanities. And thank you, Carla, and thank you, Janet, for the invitation and the kind introduction. That was a minute of my presentation, so thank you. So thank you for your generous invitation. I'm gonna give you an introduction to what we're talking about. It's gonna be very brief, and so we can move on. So the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Program, USLDH, at the University of Houston draws from the rich archival collections at the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage in order to make visible the reading legacy of Latinos and Latinas in the United States since colonial times until 1980. Through almost 30 years of research, the Recovery Program and its associates all over the nation and abroad have been able to compile a comprehensive bibliography of more than 18,000 records that document the rich reading legacy of Latinas and Latinos in the United States. Recovery's repository includes books, pamphlets, manuscripts, and ephemera, and a collection of more than 1,400 newspapers in English, Spanish, French, and Ladino, starting with the first newspaper published in Spanish in the United States called El Mississippi, published in New Orleans in 1808. During our recorder presentation, we focus on the use of underrepresented archives to reconfigure how we understand the past and imagine a more inclusive future. We discuss the types of materials available in the recovery collection, the attention to ethical choices when dealing with underrepresented archives, and the critical interventions that can take place at pedagogical and research levels. We also discussed the use of digital tools to include students and community members in the process of knowledge production, and digital access through visualizations, maps, timelines, and exhibits. Moreover, we describe the active ways that Recovery USLDH engages with the community to preserve and raise awareness of history. This includes post-custodial archives, community events, and public history initiatives that serve to involve community members and community historians in the preservation and sharing of knowledge. And together, we show how to use archival materials in the undergraduate classrooms and how they have the potential to create a student-centric understanding of public history. We invite you to visit our website at artepublicopress.com and explore Recovery and USLDH for digital projects, historical content, community building, and grant opportunities. Do not miss our recent call for grants in aid funded with a generous grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The call is open right now and awards a stipend of $7,500 to scholars for research and development of digital scholarship in the form of a digital publication or a digital project. You can also visit our 2020 cohort and their projects for future reference. We hope our recorded presentation can be useful and as you think and create your own digital projects. Thank you.
Great. So was there anyone else in your group that wanted to speak today, or should we open it up to Q&A now?
I think that we decided to give some time for Q&A so
Great.
we can answer as many questions as we can.
So I'll just reiterate to the to the attendees that if you could try to ask your question in the Q&A section, and we'll be able to see those and answer them accordingly. But I have a question while we wait for some questions to come in. So from your recorded presentation, and this, I think this was something that Gabby had mentioned, you talked about key questions. It was in the section, key questions for our praxis. And one of the questions that like really stuck out to me was, how do you create meaningful and respectful data? So this stood out to me because like, I think a lot of people think about data in general as like something passive, like something to collect that's just out there existing, neutral, and it's just ready to be collected and then analyzed. So I was hoping you could expand on what your perspective of what meaningful and respectful data means.
Thank you for that wonderful question. What a great way to start for us. I think the way we envision and think about data for our project and for anything that we do in regards to US Latinos is to be respectful of where that data comes from, right? We understand we work with recovered materials, and recovered materials are publications and materials that existed in this territory before the US. Many of them existed before the US became a nation. And we fight against the erasure of a lot of these voices and the representation. So we want to make sure that when we collect them and we incorporate the data, or we use those materials as data for our research projects, that we understand that they come from a history that is often riddled with trauma and erasure, and it's fighting for that opportunity to gain that agency. And so on the one hand, we want to make sure that we give that opportunity. We also want to make sure that they're contextualized within the space, the time in which they were produced. Because oftentimes we fall into the idea of working with things that are like fashionable at the moment, right? So we want to do, Latinx stuff, or we want to do Latina or Latino things, or we want to do, something that deals with family, or something that has to do with, right now that we're celebrating the Hispanic heritage. And we don't want to fall into those traps. So we want to make sure that we understand the context. We understand that a lot of these items, or these voices, like this data, belong to actual people who had they had the opportunity to present their voice, right, to speak on their own, they would have done it, right? But the situation and the structural, systems and prejudices that exist did not give them that voice. So we want to make sure that we see them as active agents. I cite Maria Cotera's Chicana praxis. We also have developed our own USLDH Latinx praxis that comes from a feminist perspective, where we give this data the opportunity, or we extend the mic to this data, and we feel that this data are also producing knowledge alongside us as scholars or as activists, right, within this whole construction of producing a project.
Thank you. So we do have a question here. So this question is, does the digital itself become part of the archive? Interested in how far the archive goes up into the present, and what the methods of preserving digital ephemera are.
So the recovery program focuses specifically on recovered texts, as Carolina mentioned, from the colonial era up to the 1980s. So us specifically have, we've defined an era that we want to focus on. However, we recognize that, yes, there are archives focused on the, ongoing digital projects, digital ephemera, even the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive are doing that type of work. We recognize that that these are important documents, texts, etc., that are capsulizing something specific about the moment. So, you know, I think the short answer is yes, the digital is part of the archive too. It just depends on like who's doing the archiving, and that's always been the question, right? Like who's doing the archiving and who is defining the archive are very powerful questions to ask. And just historically, the people who've been defining what the archive is are very Anglo-centric, hegemonic, like thinkers, right? And so part of what the recovery does is really push the limits, because the fabric of the United States, or what we know as the United States, is much more complex than just the Anglo-European historical model.
Thank you so much for that. So I have another question here, and I really love this question. How do you apply the ethics of care for when it comes to collecting the data, i.e. approaching organizations and individual families for access? How does the work with an institutional overview that may be at odds or directly culpable with trauma?
That's also a really great question. We're very active working with the community. As Gabby said before, we have an extensive archive that of materials that were even before this country was the United States. So we have recovered materials everywhere, and not necessarily in institutions, because they were not part of the institution. And that's a big part of our recovery process, because we need to talk to our communities and make them believe that what they have in their archives and their personal archives is important, not only for them and their families, but also as an historical record of the whole community. That there's abuelita's journals in the kitchen was so important, because women, and especially Latina women, had not spaces to write. And that was probably the only space that they had. So we create bonds with the community. We talk to them, and because we need for them to trust some kind of archive again. That's why we are an alternative archive and an archive per se. It's been so long since they have seen themselves and their collections in the archive, that it's very important for us to convey the importance of these collections to be somewhere to be preserved, especially with the climate the way it is right now. And not only for preservation purposes, but also for representation purposes. We need these stories to be part of an institutional archive. But we also understand the other part, that they're not trusting the archive. So we work with the post-custodial model. That we've been doing this way before it was called post-custodial, by the way. So we work with the institutions and small societies, historical societies, small museums, family members, and we borrow the collections. We make copies, we digitize the information, we use to microfilm it, and we give it back to them. And with tools to preserve it, and with copies of the digital content. So we are very aware of all the fine line that we need to work on that. And also we involve the community in future projects. And that's exactly what we're doing with LULAC right now, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the biggest civil rights organization in the country for Latinas and Latinos right now. So we are actively working with them and their members to collect information, but also involving them into the process of creating access to these collections with, meetings every month and things like that. So it's an extra step, it's extra work, but you need to be willing to do that, to be able to, not to just get the information from the community, but to be part of this knowledge production. In terms of collections, we have a variety. Latinos were producing all kinds of, knowledge from different sides. The Mexican Revolution, we had information from both sides, from, against the revolution and pro the revolution. It is really important for our community to see and understand that our thinking is very varied. It's not homogeneous. We Latinos and Latinas are a huge community that comes from different countries that came to the United States. We're an immigrant community that is very rich. And to collect these different ways of thinking, it's also a way to show that richness.
Thanks. So from your presentation, this is one of my questions. You talked actually about how your methods aren't emerging because you've been doing this process for a long time. So maybe it doesn't quite fit in this session. But can you talk about how your process has evolved since you first started doing this, and how, I don't know, if has technology affected that at all, or other factors?
I think that being the oldest one on the project, I have to answer that. Well, we are certainly seeing the change in technology. You know, I mean, this is something that I mentioned in some of our talks. We started digitizing materials probably when nobody else was doing it. I mean, when I talk about microfilm, that was the only way of preservation, you know, and well, digitization wasn't a way of preservation until very recently anyway. So we started digitizing, and I remember this, we were students, research assistant with Gabby at that time, you know, using one scanner, microfilm scanner, to be able to collect and index this information. So something that illustrates this, the changes in technology is that we started digitizing materials when the highest resolution was 97 TIFF. So that gives you an idea. So we had to move with the times, and we have a very visionary working with us, Dr. Nicolas Canelos. He is the director of Arte Público Press and the recovery program, and he's always been pushing for innovation and giving us the opportunity to move forward the program. And with us, that we're just the face of the recovery program, we have hundreds of scholars associated with us. So we are in charge of moving the whole program into something different, into technology. So we have to advance with the times, advance with, you know, the ways of dissemination, the materials, and the ways that we preserve the information. We move from little discs to copy the material to now, you know, being everything in the cloud and everything else. So it's been a very interesting cloud, but we're here, and we will continue moving along, and you know, and being innovative in this sense.
Thanks. Okay, so I have a question from the Q&A here. How can an individual know that there are institutions like Arte Público Press and the Recovery Project collecting documents, letters, newspapers, etc.? What kind of publicity do these institutions do within the community?
Well, I think one of the things that we you know, Arte Público Press is a Latino publisher, right, in the U.S., one of the oldest Latino publishers in the U.S. And so one of the things that we do is we try to already, we're established and try to get that information as much as possible through like traditional venues. Unfortunately, it is not always easy to get that information out, because you get, you know, we're already known for doing one thing, and so you kind of like get pigeonholed into doing this one thing. And so, like, for example, here in Houston, people say, oh, you're Houston's biggest kept secret, which is a horrible thing to say, because it doesn't help us. We need to have, you know, a lot of more, you know, more publicity. We need to, for people to see, you know, some of the things that we're doing. And so it really is a matter of sharing like the information that we're doing, sharing some of the projects, right? Ever since Lorena came into our group, she came into the USLDH team as a CLEAR postdoc fellow 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. 3 years ago she came in. This last year was her last year, and And so she was, she did amazing work for us in getting, in working with social media. Laura, you want to say a little bit about that? And so she was able to figure out ways to collaborate with different organizations and to leverage some of the work that we were doing so that we could, start building more community in that way.
I think Gabby is anticipating the next question because it connects to that. So can I jump into that and tie the two? Do you want to read it? Do you want me to read it?
You can read it. Go ahead.
Okay. So, so the next question is, as an archives that is part of a larger educational institution, what kinds of knowledge sharing are you providing to community organizations with fewer resources? Is training or other resources part of this collaboration? So just picking off of where Gabby left off, social media has been really, really helpful to us, and we're hoping to still expand that. So definitely follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and we've got we're starting our YouTube channel as well. So we've been trying to create a network on there, connecting to other digital humanists, as well as to people who are doing Latino studies and working with underrepresented archives. So if you tweet about US Latinx digital humanities, please, we encourage you to use the hashtag USLDH. And that's really helped us make these connections and form collaborations, whether it be within the university or outside to the community. So we've offered training whenever we've done like workshops. They've been open to the public, and we've made connections with people in HISD, for example, and different universities. We've partnered with the Black Lunch Table here in Houston, which is it's an organization across the country, and there's local chapters that is focused on making more visible the work of Black artists. And so what we've done is Wikipedia edit-a-thons with Black Lunch Table, the Black Lunch Table representative, Jason Oliver, who is from HISD, sorry, I got distracted by a little, my son, but to teach people how to edit Wikipedia, and then also why it's important, because people of color are vastly underrepresented on Wikipedia, as well as editors. And so this is one way we connect to the community. We've also had community events where we release projects in a space that is meant for the community to show the community how to access this information. Because one of the problems is if you Google Latina, I assure you the majority of your first hits, especially image searches, are not going to be about historical figures or art history. Instead, they're over-sexualized and objectified images. And so one of the things we want to do is really change that for our own children, for our own community, for the greater community as well, because we've got that rich history that we want to make more accessible. So we're trying to reach out to people on K through 12. We're using it in our own classes. We're using social media to get this information to people, so that they know that they can use it in their classes, so that we can do presentations at places if they don't know how to do this, and then do the training. And then now, we're going to try to provide recorded trainings and tutorials as well, or just, lists of resources. And this has been, it's growing. And so like I said, I encourage you to follow us on social media, and then we can make connections that way too. And hopefully you'll share our stuff as well.
If I just can add a couple of things, Lorena has been doing a wonderful job with all social media. We also, the way that we connect with the community is to partner with the community members and community institutions like LULAC and Set Jobs, and to invite high school students to train with us during the summer. So we are very committed and forming and training the future scholars. So we are feeding the pipeline that is mentioned right now, beginning very early. And we have had wonderful high school students participating in projects and creating their own projects with us. So that's something that we do. And in relationship with our connection with the community this morning and our work, I was talking to Gabby. I was telling her that it's so wonderful. We this connection that we have with a community historian. We created a Google Doc to collect all the information about Latinx projects in the United States, because when we started working on this, there was just a few of them, and they were isolated, so we didn't have a community. So in order to create this community and to make these projects available, we created a Google Sheet that we share with everybody. When we shared this with the community, they took the Google Sheet and they make their own. So yesterday I got a message from the community historian saying, somebody in Facebook said, where can I find these interviews from a historical leader in the community? And he said, oh, it's at Arte Publico's Google Sheet. I added everything in there. And by the way, in an internal message, he said, I took the liberty to add some tabs in there for videos. So this is wonderful because they're making this their own. So they're creating their own information and distributing the information, not only to an academic level, but to a community level as well.
So thank you so much from the USLDH team for both the excellent video and this really fascinating Q&A. So, and I'm glad I got to ask my questions. So we're going to move on to the From Words to Networks, text-based semantic network analysis. So this is the team from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign iSchool.
I'm Julian Qing. May I share my screen? Can you hear me?
So you're not sharing your screen,
Okay.
but we can see. Okay, it's starting to work now. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. So let me start. Hello, everyone. My name is Julian Qing. I'm a research manager at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm joined today with my awesome colleagues at the iSchool, Professor Yana Disner, PhD student Janina Serro, and Lin Zhang, to introduce our tutorial, From Words to Networks, Text-Based Semantic Network Analysis. In this tutorial, we introduce you to some fundamental theories, concepts, and methods that have been developed for constructing network data based on text data. We will show you some selected entry-level analysis techniques and show you what questions can be answered by using this method. After a brief introduction to the history and common types of relation extraction from text data, we will introduce you to specific analysis methods that are commonly used in text analysis in the social science and humanities research. For this part, we will use Context, an open source tool developed by our team. Context is designed as a tool for newcomers and practitioners to this field and meant to help to learn methods in any informed way that supports them to answer their questions. No specific methodological or technical skills are necessary to start using this tool. More specifically, you will learn how to use context to conduct text summarization, text preprocessing, entity detection, and relation extraction. So for text summarization, it is a natural language processing method that helps to identify the most frequent and salient terms mentioned in some texts. In this tutorial, you will learn how to identify the top words and concepts from open source sample data, particularly from the stage of the Union speeches that President Obama gave between 2009 and 2016. We will then introduce you to pre-processing, which is generally used to prepare text data for further analysis. This family of methods helps to improve the quality of results and processing time. We will demo how to remove star words from our sample data and how to further refine the results. Next, we will introduce you how to extract relational data from unstructured natural text data. You will learn about basic elements of words networks and how to identify them from text data. We also address common approaches to linking nodes based on text data and identifying relations among entities. Last but not least, we will showcase a visualization of the network extracted in context and visualized in another tool named Gephi. We will summarize the knowledge and skills you have learned in the tutorial and point out next steps and references for further learning. So after walking through the tutorial, we hope that you will be better informed about basic theories, concepts, and methods for constructing networks from text, and let you know why and how to apply some of these techniques in context. Moreover, you will have seen examples how to interpret your results to answer research questions that are common for digital humanities projects. That's all that we have covered in the tutorial. Please let us know if you have any questions or suggestions section. Thank you.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions. And again, if you can ask in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat, that would be great. I have a question for the team. So in the tutorial, you showed some really good, some interesting analysis of social and information networks. And the one that I'm thinking of is that Les Mis visualization network. And so I'm just curious if you have like current projects that you're working on that you're using this type of analysis for that you're really interested in.
Yeah, hey, this is Jana. I can take that question. So yes, we have a whole bunch of current projects that folks might be interested in and that has a relationship to the digital humanities context. For one, we are currently working in a collaboration with the US Coast Guard to help them use relation extraction to identify networks of emergency responders and emergency response mechanisms from open source text data and comparing them to mandates and policy of how response should happen, and then see if there are activities that routinely are being provided by first responders and people in the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief context that could be added to policy, or if there are things that are currently and routinely not happening, maybe because they are impossible, and they might also require revisions of policy. So that's a connection between relation extraction and public policy work.
Thank you. Wow, that sounds like it has an actual real life impact on emergency response.
We are trying. I'll post a link to that in the chat so people can read more about it. And if people have thoughts or ideas or questions about that, I'd be more than happy to hear back from folks in the audience on that as well, of course.
So I have a question here. What are some ways in which you've seen people do work on novels and poetry using context? Examples, saw the Les Mis example, but interested in ways in which people are using the tool in connection with literary works.
Yeah, I can answer that too. I don't know. People sometimes cite context. I didn't look into every single paper that did refer to us, but on a more abstract level, not just our tool, but in general, entity detection and relation extraction is done a lot from novels. Names that you might know about is, let me to put this in the question, can I? There are a couple of answers coming in here, but I put something in the chat. So David Bauman out at Berkeley is doing some of these things. I'm not exactly sure if I got the spelling right. And then of course you could say that, well, I leave that aside. But there are definitely people who have been using literary work to identify entities. That's very common, right? And oftentimes when they capture relationships, they do the most straightforward thing. They just do that based on collocation. That's a fair way to say there's some sort of an association between entities, but you could also go deeper and use other methods like deep and shallow syntax parsing in order to dig a little deeper into the relationships that characters in literary work do have.
Thank you. So there is another question here. What languages are supported in context? Is Arabic supported?
Depends. So wasn't there a slide in the tutorial? There is a slide that exactly says which routines are language dependent and which languages are which routines are language independent. For everything that goes left to right and top to bottom in terms of language flow or text representation of language flow, we have a couple of things that are language agnostic, where it doesn't matter. It's basically just parsing strings into tokens and doing things with them. And then there are a couple of things like syntax parsing or most of the qualitative work that we support, like codebook construction, codebook application. Those are language dependent. So there's a mix.
Thanks. Is the context tool used for social media data, comments, posts, etc.?
People have done that. It's not the best tool, and our goal with this tutorial is not to make you a pro in context in general. It's more like give you an overview of these methods, and for those people in the audience who don't have deep experience with Python or cobbling together their own pipelines of analysis thingies, this is really just a practice. This is your 101 safe sandbox for just messing around with data and learning a little bit of the methods. And once you know what you're doing, I would strongly recommend to upgrade to a more advanced tool or work with libraries directly and then do things there. You can definitely load tweet data into context and do things there. And people have done that, but just see this tool as one out of many that allows you to use these methods that we are introducing people to. I guess the goal with our tutorial is more to give you a very high level, entry level overview on a couple of these very common text analysis methods in the digital humanities, and also show you how they relate to network representations of information. And then once people are sufficiently skilled with doing that, they can take it to the next level and work with libraries directly.
Thank you. Would this be good for extracting and mapping common issues using original interviews as a data source?
For that, there are other methods that we didn't cover. For example, topic modeling lets you see general themes that bubble up from your data or prevalent themes in your data. We support that too, and for that we leverage a tool by Andrew McCollum out of Amherst called Mallet. That's what we use for topic modeling there, and that you can use to basically track and check emerging themes in your data. If you just wanted to get to key concepts in your data, you could use a couple of these methods that we offer or that are out there for salient entity detection or salient term detection, like TF-IDF, mutual information gain, entropy, simple weighted frequencies. Those are all good options for doing that. And if the person who asked that question has a more specific question, he or she would be welcome to email us and let us know. We're happy to look more into that.
Great. The same person who had asked that question says they're just really interested in how the tool could be operationalized in their current project as a humanities scholar. So I think the nice thing about your tutorial is it's very intro. You can just start doing stuff with text like right away in context, which is so maybe that's where they could start. Just try using it.
I guess, but the best way to start any of these projects is be very clear about what is the question you are having, what data do you have, and does your data allow you to answer that question, and then think about methods and tools. But once you know exactly what it is that you want to find out,
that should naturally lead you to a method, and then you could check what methods, tool or not, some of them are also just tool free, right, support you in what you want to do. And again, there are many, many good NLP tools out there and libraries. There's NLP, there is the Stanford suite of text mining tools, there is OpenNLTK, there are plenty of open source options that people could leverage and extend and use for their work.
So that actually leads to a question that I had, which is, do you know, and maybe you don't know this because you don't know everyone who has used context, obviously, you only know from the ones that you've seen cited, but do you think people approach it with a text in mind, and they just want to see what that text reveals, or do you think they approach it with a specific research question first? And I guess you kind of make it sound like maybe it's better to have the research question first, right?
So that almost sounds like the difference between exploratory work and more in-depth analysis. I would always recommend starting with a question, and even if the question is just, hey, I'm curious about these text data, what's in it, that's legitimate, right? That's a first useful step to take, and at least see how big it is, what's your vocabulary that shows up there, how broadly spread is that vocabulary, what are the main concepts, what are the main entities, stuff like that. I'm a big fan of starting with a question, because then you don't get lost in the 80 routines that a tool has, not ours, but many have many routines, right? But if your goal is just to learn using these methods, then just having a text and play around and be like, ooh, this is what it does, and this is what it not does, and it's weird does it do that, let me understand why that happens. That's all fair game.
Great, thanks. So we'll just see if there's any other questions that come in.
And as maybe Janina, who's also, she's a PhD student also in our group, Janina, if you could put a couple of links to other tools into the chat for people, like OpenNLTK and the Stanford stuff and NLP, so that people also have some pointers to more sophisticated tools, that would be nice.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time and of both creating the tutorial and your presentation today and your question and answer session.
And I'll add in a couple more specific answers to people, so they,
sure.
Yeah, to add in a couple more details. I cannot read and speak, that's hard for me, but I'll follow up with the questions now. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, so the next presentation is Digital Storytelling on the Border. So this is Mary Kate Coleman from UIC.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm a little under the weather, so you have to forgive me. My voice is a little cracky. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you to the Digital Humanities Institute, and thank you to everyone for attending this presentation. I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Okay, my name is Mary Kate Coleman. I'm going to be talking just a little bit about digital storytelling as a tool to conduct creative research and as a collaborative mode of cross-cultural communication. Specifically, I'll be talking about my experience as an investigator with the digital storytelling project, Humanizing Deportation. Humanizing Deportation is a digital storytelling project that's based out of UC Davis. We're partnered with a number of institutions, Mexican and American. We have investigators working in 7 cities throughout Southern California and Mexico. We work primarily with people who've been deported. But we also work with basically anybody who has an immigration story they want to tell. We work with people who are waiting to seek asylum in Mexico, with undocumented people in the United States. We collaborate one-on-one, an academic investigator with a community storyteller, to create digital stories related to their immigration experiences. So digital stories, digital storytelling in this context refers to a mode pioneered by Story Center, which used to be the Center for Digital Storytelling. I talk a little bit more about that in the video. Generally, a digital story is a 2 to 5 minute narrative that tells a personal story. It's characterized by the personal voice. It's told in first person using vernacular expression. The process involves creating a script of the story, recording the audio for that script, and then adding audio-visual elements like photos, videos, music, subtitles, etc., to create a brief collage-like video. It's created using programs that are easy to access and easy to use. A lot of my colleagues like iMovie. I personally prefer WeVideo. WeVideo is an online video editor, and the reason I like it is because sometimes I have community storytellers who want to participate in the video editing process, and so I'm able to just sort of give them my login and password, and they can access a video editing account from any computer. They can go in there and start moving photos around, adding in elements. It sort of makes the process more collaborative. So, and also one of the key things about digital stories is that because they're brief and they're online, they're easy to share via the internet, on social media, via text, etc. The applications for digital stories include everything from personal uses, like sharing a story about your family's history with your mom, your cousins, etc., to use as legal evidence. Some of our digital stories for the project are being used in immigration cases. But their primary uses are for activism and community building, and also for use in the classroom. Our digital stories are used in all kinds of disciplines, from Latino studies classes to Spanish classes, immigration classes. Personally, I think a lot about the use of digital stories in the creative writing classroom. They're great for students just learning about digital nonfiction. They're also an exercise in concision, as you are typically writing scripts that are going to be around 250 to 350 words. In terms of the collaboration between the community storyteller and the investigator, one of the key principles of our methodology is that the narrator is the author, the director, the photographer, etc. The facilitator does all the audio and video editing, but the goal really is to make every effort to minimize your influence as a facilitator over how the digital story turns out. As you can imagine, this becomes tricky when the narrator isn't super invested in the process or doesn't have a lot of time to give the project. The facilitator ends up having to make a lot more qualitative decisions about how the story gets told. This is one of the things I talk a little bit more about in the video presentation, sort of the difficulties I encountered in the field in terms of the difference between the principles of our methodology as laid out to me during training and how things actually work in the real world. That's why I mentioned at the end here some limitations of the genre. When it's a collaboration, there's always going to be the question of the control over the content. So here on this last slide, I just wanted to mention a few things that I talk about more in depth in the video presentation for anyone who hasn't watched it. I go into more detail about our methodology, which is adapted from the methods of Story Center. I talk about the difficulty of being an independent investigator in a foreign country, figuring out effective methods of recruiting, slowly building community over time. I talk about the emotional role of the investigator and how this kind of work can be both invigorating and difficult when you're hearing stories of intense trauma on almost a daily basis. And I talk about how, for me, this opportunity to work as an investigator for Humanizing Deportation was also an opportunity to ethically conduct creative research. I would never use any of the details from my collaborators' lives or their stories, of course, But I got to hear many stories that deal in the emotional themes of my novel, alienation, citizenship, community, etc., which is really helpful for my creative work. And lastly, this kind of digital storytelling creates cross-cultural communication in both large and small scale ways, as the collaboration produces an artifact that gets used in university classrooms on both sides of the border. But it also creates a sort of unique cross-cultural relationship between the investigator and the community storyteller. So I wish I had time to show you a digital story or two. If you have the chance to go watch the video presentation, you'll get to see a handful of digital stories that have come out of my work with both Humanizing Deportation and with Story Center. So I will go ahead and stop the screen share. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And yeah, if you have a chance, like Kate said, if you have a chance to watch the video, there are some really great examples of the digital stories that you created, which is really fun to watch. So let's see, we have one question here. I find digital stories very interesting to get to know it more and do more research about it while doing my MA in DHS. So it could be applied in many humanities fields to present them in a creative way, like presenting history or literature. So I guess that's not really a question, but we'll turn it into a question. Do you think this method could be used then for presenting history or literature?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think the part of what the participants, the collaborators who were working with our project are doing is creating a sort of grassroots history for themselves, because part of the reason that the project was created is because there's a dearth of firsthand accounts of the deportation process and of immigration stories sort of on a larger scale. So, you know, in this sort of act of participating and collaborating with the project, they're sort of contributing their own history in a first-person narrative, which I think is really meaningful and something that could be used across disciplines.
Great, thanks. So say I wanted to undertake a similar project, but I would be doing this all on my own, not with the help of an organization like you had. Could you lay out the steps of how exactly I would move through a project like this? Is it like, 1, you meet the subject, 2, you have them write out their story as a script? Is that kind of the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sort of the first part of that is recruiting, and kind of telling people about what it is that you're trying to do and what sort of project you're going to be undertaking, showing them some examples of digital stories, and so that they can get a feel for what this process looks like, what the end product is going to be. And then for my project, what we do is we get together one-on-one. That first meeting is really about learning more about the project and me learning more about this person, more about their story, and us kind of discussing, you know, what shape they would like their story to take. For example, people with immigration stories and deportation stories in particular, sometimes they want to sort of tell a whole overview of their life and everything that's happened to them, everything that's happened since their deportation. Sometimes they want to really focus in on one specific thing. They want to talk about something that happened one day in immigration detention because it was really messed up, and they want the world to know that this happens to people in immigration detention. Other times people, their personal stories are hardly even about themselves. They want to, really what they want to focus on is their deportation and how this affected their kids. And so the entire story is about their kids and what their kids have gone through since their deportation. And so the first meeting is really about trying to figure out what angle you're going to go from in the telling of the story. The second meeting is usually about writing the script together. Sometimes at the end of the second meeting, you'll have everything ready to go and you'll go ahead and record that script. The third meeting maybe would be about gathering audiovisual elements, gathering photos, gathering videos, trying to figure out what the placement would be. Sometimes people want you to just, you know, they trust you, say, hey, you know, you go ahead and add in the photos, I'll just sort of check it later and see what it looks like. Other times people are really specific about their vision. They want to storyboard everything so that it comes out exactly, you know, the way that they had planned in their mind. And then, you know, generally, by the time you've gotten to the 5th or 6th meeting, usually you're getting to the point where, you know, you've got all the audio visual elements in place. You know, you might at that point be adding subtitles in Spanish or English, depending on what story on what language the story is in. And then just kind of checking things over, finishing it up, you know, putting in transitions between the photos, all that kind of stuff. And then the final meeting is really about watching it together, discussing how things have come out, and figuring out if any additional changes need to be made before the story gets published. Now that is the model of working one-on-one, an academic investigator with a community storyteller. But there's also, as I talk a little bit more about in the video, there's the model of doing this as a group, where Story Center, who originally came up with this methodology, this kind of digital storytelling, they have a 3 full-day workshop in which you first get together, learn about digital storytelling, what it is, how it works, and then the whole afternoon of the first day is devoted to the story circle, which is everybody as a community sharing your story together and getting a little bit of positive feedback from peers about what they find interesting about your story, about what, which way to focus their story, basically. And then days 2 and 3 are all about everyone working individually on their own story. They're doing all the audio editing, all the video editing, and there's a facilitator or 2 in the room present to kind of answer questions about the technology and facilitate that process. And then at the end of the 3rd day, there is a showing of everyone's finished videos. So that is a model that works quite well in a classroom setting, in a setting where you have, a bunch of people together at the same time wanting to sort of do this, everybody learn all together how to go through the digital storytelling process. But I think, either way works. Both have their advantages and their challenges, but that's generally how we go about the digital storytelling process.
So when you do the individual one-on-one work, is it that same kind of like timeline though, where it's, because it sounds like when you do the group project, it's like at the end of it, you have, in just 3 days, you have your finished stories. But with the individual ones, there's like a longer timeline maybe?
Generally, because people don't usually have 3 full days to devote to you and to, people work, they've got kids, they're busy. So that's kind of why it tends to be spaced over time. It tends to be spaced over, a meeting of an hour or 2 here. The next week, another meeting of an hour or 2. That's the model is the, the 5 or 6 meetings and really collaborating throughout the entire process, meeting over and over again to figure it out. But as I said in the longer video, it doesn't always work that way. A lot of times people just don't have that much time to give you. And so as the investigator, as a facilitator, you're kind of guessing a little bit more about what it is that they want you to do with the video. And in that case, you might only meet 2 or 3 times. So it just kind of depends on the person, on the participant.
Great. And so actually along the same lines as that question, we have a question here in the Q&A. How much do the stories get crafted over time for the project? Interested in how much the storytelling process intersects with humanities critical methods? And how much do you want individual narratives to shape a larger narrative about the deportation process? Is there a meta story that needs to be told? And then he apologizes for a long question.
Oh no, that's a great question. I would say it's less of, do you want the individual story to create a larger story? It's not that we want that to happen, but it is happening as we collect these stories, because as they started to kind of trickle in little by little. First we had 10 stories, then we had 60, then we had 300. You start to, watching the stories over time, you start to notice themes about people's experiences, their experiences of alienation, of desperation, of, so many people, for example, tell me that their experience right after getting deported was that they were going to go back. They had it in their mind completely. They were going to go back. They were going to work and save some money until they could pay a coyote to get them back across the border again. And that's sort of like one kind of theme, one example of the kind of emotional process that people go through when they experience this traumatic event. And so, yeah, I guess all that to say that you know, a larger narrative is present in the videos, although it's not at all our goal to create that. It's just sort of organically created through the commonalities of people's experiences.
Thanks. So I really appreciate your advice to be flexible with your expectations in regards to collaboration, how collaborations will go with participants. But how did you resolve the problem with Juan's story? How did you decide which material to keep and which material to cut? Because like you said, those choices will shape the story.
Thank you so much for that question. I actually talked a little bit more about that. I just talked and talked and talked in my original video, and then I had to cut it down. But really with Juan, what I decided was that, you know, our interview was 90 minutes long, and then I had to go through and cut everything down to whatever it was, 6 or 7 minutes, and I was really struggling to figure out what to do. But the decision for me was made in that out of those 90 minutes, he probably talked for 81 of those minutes about his family. And so it just seemed to me that that because like the majority of the time of our interview was spent really delving into how this affected his wife, how this affected his kids, I decided, well, you know what, I'm just going to focus on that and then run it by him and see what he says. You know, he might have come back and said, you know what, this is great, but I really, it's super important to me to have the deported veteran stuff in there. That's, you know, that's my cause. That's, you know, we need to focus on that more. But he didn't. You know, I showed it to him and he said, you know what, I originally thought this was going to be a deported veteran story, but people need to know that we're daddies too. I think that's like a direct quote. And he's like, so yeah, I like it. Let's move forward with it just like this. And so, okay. So that is how I kind of resolved that problem for myself in the moment. You know, how I edited, I mean, Juan is such an easygoing guy that he probably would have said, okay, either way, you know, like even if I had focused it on something else or included more of the backstory of his criminal history and all that stuff. So to some extent, I will never know if I got it quite right. He says he's happy with it, and I think he is. But you know, I think with this kind of collaboration, flexibility is key, and you just have to do your best, and you have to be really open to feedback, and you have to trust people to tell you the honest truth about how they feel about the work that you've done, because all you can do is go off of what they tell you.
Thank you. So another question here, could you briefly describe how all the different partners of Humanizing Deportation work together? How does the project manage a large team of people working in multiple countries? And is there a centralized kind of workflow?
That is an excellent question, and one that I can sort of only partially answer since I'm not involved in kind of the administrative aspects of the project. I think it has been a real challenge. If you talk to my principal investigator, I think there are certain teams in certain cities at certain universities that have been really productive and have you know, gone on to produce lots of digital stories, like according to the methodology we set out, and that's been sort of gone exactly as planned. And then there have been some sites that are not as productive, that kind of like there's nobody really there coordinating in a very serious way, and so they never quite produce as much. And then there have been some sites where you know, the methodology just goes wonky. Robert Irwin, who is the PI of my project, was telling me about how one of the sites, people started assigning digital stories to their classes, and then they had a bunch of undergrads going out into the field and collecting stories, but the undergrads didn't know how to or didn't have the technology to actually make the digital stories. So then they were like hiring out an audio-visual expert to like then go through and put together. So it kind of turned into something that didn't really match up with the expectations that had been set out in the methodology of the project when people were trained on it. So the project is very new. It's been around for 3 or 4 years, and I think that they have dealt with they've had to troubleshoot all kinds of problems, especially as we've expanded so quickly. But some of the ways that the different sites work together, for example, I'm not going to be able to pull up the names of these organizations right now, but I know that we work with universities in Guadalajara and in Juarez, in basically all the Mexico City, basically all the major cities in Mexico. And then we are also working with arts and cultural organizations, and particularly with activist groups. And so sometimes these organizations will kind of get together in one of the cities and have a public exposition in a cultural center, where it's a 3-day exposition. They have speakers, they show the digital stories on a big screen, and it creates a greater sense of connection and community between people doing this kind of work, from academia, people studying issues about deportees and returnees in academia, to people trying to start grassroots activism groups. And particularly, I know from friends in those activist organizations that this has been really helpful with connecting different activist organizations for deportees in different cities throughout Mexico to try to create some sort of more unified response to deportation and the experience of deported people in Mexico.
Okay, thank you so much, Mary Kate.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, again, I just want to remind everyone that we are recording, and also to please type your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. So we have 2 tutorials for session 2, which focuses on project planning and management. The first is Strategies for a Successful First Research Project in the Digital Humanities by Simon Appleford, Assistant Professor in the Department of History and Associate Director of the Creighton Digital Humanities Initiative at Creighton University and co-author of devdh.org. The second is Multilingual Content Management in the Core Proust Project by 3 colleagues at our Urbana-Champaign campus, Claire Beides. Claire, I'm so sorry if I did not pronounce that correctly, a PhD candidate in comparative literature, Nicholas Stroll, who recently received his PhD in French, and Dina Strong, MLIS, Senior Information Design Specialist in Technology Services. So I'll turn it over first to Dr. Appleford, who will talk about strategies for a successful first research project in DH.
Okay. Thank you, Carla, for that introduction and for this opportunity to talk to everyone. Can you see the presentation or the keynote back end?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So just to, this is actually a very Illinois-oriented session because I'm actually a graduate from U of I. I got my PhD in history from Illinois. So it's nice to be on the panel with fellow Illini. So very briefly, so the focus of my presentation, my workshop, and really what I wanted to stress, because this is an anxiety that I come across all the time when I'm working with folks who are just getting started in digital humanities, is that actually very fundamentally, a digital humanities project is no different to any other humanities project that you might be involved with. Yes, you might be looking at slightly different types of questions. Yes, you do have to have other considerations in terms of what types of, in terms of having to take into consideration issues of technology, different venues, different types of products that you're producing. But ultimately, the components that make up a successful research project, and they're on this slide here. You know, a research project is a sequence of related activities derived from a question, issue, or problem that requires the use of or development of resources for an audience or other types of partners, and results in a product is a very lengthy way of saying it's a research question. And if you take nothing else from my presentation, if you take nothing else from what I have to say, I think the most important thing for you to remember as you're getting started in digital humanities is that at every level, your question should drive your project. It should, the question that you're interested in doing should drive what sources, whether we're talking about primary historical sources, secondary sources from the scholarly literature, or data sets that have been created by either yourself or by others in the field. Your question drives that decision. And likewise, the question should drive the tool. The question should drive the technology. Don't go into a project thinking, oh, I've heard of this really cool topic, this really cool technology called topic modeling or social network analysis. I want to do something around that. Think about how your question will benefit from the use of social network analysis. Think about which particular type of social network analysis tool is most appropriate for what you want to do. It might be that you can use an off-the-shelf tool like Palladio to get the same results, to get the results to answer the question that you're interested in. You don't need to delve into something more complicated like Gephi or creating a custom solution using Python and R. Trying to overthink what you are using, the tools that you are using, trying to force a question into a specific tool that you are already comfortable with, or that someone has told you would be great for your project, is often the #1 cause of stress and concern that I see. And I will confess right now, I work primarily with undergraduate students, and oftentimes when they're developing their research projects, they're getting the idea of what tools they should be using from me. And I've told them, oh, Voyant would be this fantastic tool to use to do this and this. And when they're developing their own projects, they're like, well, I've heard of this tool, Voyant, can I use this? But they haven't thought about how they want to use it. What is the question that they want to answer by using text analysis? The other, I think, complicating factor that is hard to think about when you're talking about getting started in the digital humanities is how open the process can be. As humanists, we're so used to the model of, you know, we go into the archive, we spend our time working in a solitary endeavor. If we're lucky, we have a co-author, or we have a partner, we have someone that we can trust, that we can bounce ideas off of. But the process of creating the question, of conducting the research, of producing the end result of our research happens in isolation. And in digital humanities, yeah, that can happen as well, but it doesn't have to. There are so many different resources available for reaching out to help develop the idea, to help make sure that the project the project is using the most appropriate tools. Working in the public through making posts to Twitter, starting a blog post, contributing to an institute's website if they have the ability for students and others who are involved in that in their work to write about what they're doing, can help build your audience, can help build a community of practitioners, and can help make your projects stronger. And then, because I want to make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A, the other thing that is also really hard, I think, for people to understand is the diversity of products that can result from the digital humanities. Again, in the humanities, we're used to a book, a journal article being the main focus of what we do. But in the digital humanities, the product of your research can be a workshop like the one that we're participating in today. This is a this is an academic scholarly endeavor that has benefit, that is something that can be used and brought forward. It's the different stages of that product. The product can be released in different in different stages as you're working through it. It can result in multiple different forms of product. You could have a project that is code, that results in code as a product, that results in a data set as a product, that results in a website as a product, that results in a journal article as a product, or that results in a scholarly monograph as a product, or that results in all of the above as a product. And that is, again, a slightly different idiom to what humanities scholars are used to working in. We have this idea that we're working towards a single end result, which is often that scholarly publication, because that is what looks good in our CVs, that is what counts towards tenure and promotion, that is what counts towards job applications and finding success in the job market. And for digital humanities, yes, there is an end result, but what that end result looks like often is very different to what we can be used to, and can operate in different levels, different scales, depending on what you are interested in actually doing. I apologize, I have a cough and I'm losing my voice. But I think that's a good opportunity to kind of open it up to Q&A, because I know that time is limited, and I want to be able to answer questions and engage with folks, if that is okay with you, Carla.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Simon.
Okay.
So I have a question to start, actually. Okay. So you said in your tutorial that the field of digital humanities encourages researchers to stay engaged with their audience while conceiving and conducting research and going through the process of developing their project, right? That we should work publicly. So I'm wondering, at what point, though, do you recommend doing that, and how do you recommend doing that? For example, would you make the website, if the website is going to be the final product, would you make the website public before you have, say, your visualizations? Would you make your data set public while you're still assembling it? Do you recommend having a separate site on which you document your process? Or do you recommend making what will be your final public site? Do you recommend updating that while it's in progress? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, you know, that's a great question, because I think that this is also a, you know, it's a source of anxiety, right? When do you make your results public? And you know, there are, you know, all too often, you know, you do hear these horror stories of a graduate student or someone who has made a presentation or shared some early results from their research, and someone who hears that swoops in and sort of steals their idea and is able to claim some of the credit for it. And you know, with the precarious nature of academia right now, that's, you know, it's an absolutely valid concern. And you know, what I think I would argue is that actually by making the work public relatively early on in the process, you eliminate some of that potential, some of that danger from occurring, because you can point to, I wrote this blog post, or I've been posting on Twitter about this is what I'm doing, so that people become aware of it, people can contribute their ideas to it. There's a, you know, just as an example, if you are not following Scott Weingart on Twitter, he's a great person to follow on Twitter. He is a digital humanist working at Pittsburgh, I think, now. And he posts on Twitter all the time, about digital humanities stuff, about his personal interests and what have you. But for the last year or so, he's been posting on Twitter about a project that he's been engaged with, where he is collecting and documenting all of the conference abstracts from the ADHO, the Association of Digital Humanities Organizations, stretching back to the 1980s. So he's been trying to put together, he's been trying to, first of all, identify and find all of the conference proceedings that came out of it, and has been extracting the information on that so that he can create a major database that allows interested researchers to go in and see what in 1993 were what might be broadly construed as digital humanities. What were people talking about during those early days of digital humanities? You can also track the progress, the research interests of different people. He actually posted a link to what will become the final website a couple of days ago. So, he's been talking in public about what he is doing, about, he's talked about carting all of these boxes of conference proceedings out of his office during the pandemic. He's been posting interesting abstracts that he's come across as he's doing it. To gain awareness of the project, people have engaged in conversation with him about the types of things that he's been finding. He's been able to put out calls for people to help him fill in the blanks of when he's been unable to find particular proceedings. And now that he's on the verge with his collaborators of publishing the final product, he's engaging in conversation about sort of the scope, what they were able to achieve, some of the decisions that they were making, which will then go into sort of the documentation of the site. So, it's to go back to the question rather than to answer it with an example. I think that it's a question of what you're comfortable with. That's the most important thing. It's what you're comfortable with. It's what the needs of the project are in any given moment. But there is no right or wrong answer. I think that working on Twitter, it is a great informal way of building a community around what you're doing. It's a great way of getting support and generating interest. But writing blog posts on Medium, if you don't have your own website, launching the project website and saying that this is a beta version, and soliciting feedback on what works, what doesn't work, can help generate that. Going to conferences and showing off work in progress. The Digital Humanities Conference has lightning rounds where you can talk about work in progress. One of the great things about HILT, the Humanities Institute and Learning, I forget what the acronym is. Jen Juliana is going to kill me for that. But HILT, which is an annual training workshop, offers has a regular lightning session where people can go and they can talk about what they're doing for no more than 2 minutes, just as a way of sharing that information, sharing that knowledge. I think it all benefits ultimately, I think, to the success of the project, because people know about it, people will get excited about it, people will become invested in it, and people will want to see it succeed.
Great. So HILT is a humanities intensive learning teaching, is that correct?
Yeah, that's it.
Great, great. I would love it, Simon, if you have an opportunity before we jump off for our long break, if you have the link to that, if you could put that in the chat for our audience and panelists, that would be wonderful. Okay, let's see, I have a couple questions here. Okay, so I'm a consultant whose primary placement is in the tech department, so my main exposure to actual digital humanities tools is tangential through what else the researchers I'm working with happen to mention. But I would love to know more about the spectrum of tools used by people whose primary identity is as a humanist, so that I can help introduce students and new researchers to tools they aren't familiar with. What would your recommendation for getting a taste test of the most popular and useful DH tools be?
That is a really good question. So what I generally do is at the beginning of every semester, because the field moves so quickly, and the sort of development of tools moves very quickly. And it's actually an ongoing problem for digital humanities, a central repository that lists recommended tools for specific types of project. And there have been a couple of attempts over the years to create something sustainable. And unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, those have always ended up not working. So knowing where to go, knowing where to look for examples is an ongoing problem. I think there are a couple of resources that are out there. The first is the DH Slack, which is it's a community that uses Slack. They have all sorts of different channels attached to it, and the participants who are there are always very friendly, very open to answering questions. So if there's a particular type of technology that someone is interested in, whether it might be web scraping or scraping content from a PDF, for example, you can go to the DH Slack, you can ask, this is my use case, what would you recommend? And someone is likely to answer that question for you through that. You can also look at something like Reviews in Digital Humanities, which will review, which just started this past year, but is reviewing technologies, reviewing projects, and talking specifically about some of the underlying issues that DH projects face, and knowing what has worked well for other people will help you guide people in that direction as well. The third thing that I like to do, and I do this, I teach an Introduction to Digital Humanities class once a year, and it's relatively stable at this point. But every year I look and I see what others are teaching. So I look through those Introduction to Digital Humanities, those digital history classes, syllabuses that are out there, and see what types of tools, what technologies are popular and keep being referred to in digital humanities classrooms. And often what you'll find is, there's a series of things that, depending on the comfort level, depending on what actual how introductory you want to get, there are certain tools that people keep coming back to. So for text analysis, Voyant tools is the most common sort of gateway drug for text analysis. For working with mapping and spatial work, probably you're going to be looking at something like Mapbox. For data visualization, there might be a couple of different options. Getting started, avoid R, avoid Python.
That's great advice, yeah. I think that's great advice for beginners, for sure. Oh, I'm sorry, Simon, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's fine. I know we have more questions, so I want to make sure that those are the three areas, right? It's reach out to the community, as I say, through Slack, if you're not sure. Look at reviews, look at projects that are models of what you're interested in doing, and see what tools they've used. And looking at syllabi and see what people are using in classrooms for that sort of introduction to digital humanities. Those are the three venues that I would look towards.
Great. Okay, next question. Digital humanities is very broad, and I find myself interested in many aspects of DH. How can I focus in on one aspect or narrow down my research? Is it possible to connect more than one project or work with different aspects?
Yes. I mean, I think, it goes back to what I said at the beginning, right? Let your research question drive your interests. Mm-hmm. Always ask yourself, what does this particular tool, what does this particular technology contribute to my research question? What will it help me answer? What will help me answer differently, more effectively, more efficiently than some other tool or technology? Because DH is back in the days when everyone was debating what is digital humanities. You'd often hear about how DH is a big tent that welcomes everybody, and that's great as long as you're not getting started in DH and are completely overwhelmed by the idea that suddenly you have to learn history and literary theory and TEI and social network analysis and ArcGIS, all of these words and ideas that can be new concepts and overwhelming and frankly intimidating. It's what drives that question, and it's treat it the way that you would any other research question in the humanities. What are the components that make up the question? What are the specific things that I'm interested in doing? If you're interested in the movement of peoples across a region, you're probably going to be more interested in spatial analysis and working in ArcGIS or some other spatial tool than you are in text encoding and data visualization. There might be overlaps. I'm actually working I'm working with a project that is fundamentally a digital public project. It's about making a collection of resources available to a broader audience, but we're using text encoding, we're using spatial analysis, we're using spatial tools as part of it. So there are overlaps for it, but the decision to bring in TEI, the decision to bring in a spatial element was driven by the material that we were working with. It wasn't that we were like, oh, it would be really cool to do TEI, because I actually hate TEI. I would love not to be doing it, but I was driven there by my question. So again, let the humanities question drive it, and you'll be fine.
Great. All right, Simon, well, we're out of time. Thank you so much again, Simon. I want to tell you that your tutorial was so very comprehensive, and I thank you for that. I found it helpful. I'm sure our audience found it helpful as well.
Well, thank you, Carla. I've just thrown, oops, I just sent it to you privately, but I've just sent a link to HELT.
Oh, great.
I don't know if they're planning on holding it in person next year. I'm sure they're hoping to. And just to wrap up, if anyone here does have any questions or concerns or wants to get further resources, feel free to reach out to me. My email is my name at creighton.edu, and my Twitter handle is in the presentation. I'd be more than happy to reach out to hear from anybody. So thank you. Great.
Thanks again. Okay, so next up we have multilingual content management in the Core Proofs project. Claire Baitash, PhD candidate in comparative literature, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Nicholas Stroll, PhD in French, also University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Dina Strong, MLIS, Senior Information Design Specialist in Technology Services. And I'll let you guys go ahead and take it away.
Cool. Claire, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep, I can see it. Thanks so much for introducing us, and thank you everyone for being here. So the title of our project is Multilingual Content Management and the Core Proofs Project. And today we'll give a brief overview of some of the main points from our tutorial, which talked about how we used SharePoint for our project, why it worked, and then some conclusions and advice we got from that about how to find the right content management system for your project. So I'm Claire Baikash. I'm a PhD candidate in comparative literature. I've been an RA with the Core Proofs project since January 2019 and recently stepped into the project manager role.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick Stroll. I recently finished my PhD in French from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So last year I was the project manager for Core Proofs before making the transition to Claire in that role this year. And my principal tasks last year consisted of working with Dina Strong to develop a content management system for the project.
Hi, my name is Dina Strong. I work with Technology Services, and my title is Senior Information Design Specialist. So it is literally my job to figure out how to make your information work better. I have done this for humanists, I have done this for biologists, I have done this for astrophysicists. And we're about to explain not only the pattern that worked for this project, but also a template that you can use for considering what the shape of your project looks like.
All right, so just a little background on the project before getting into our content management solutions. So the main goal of this project was to digitize, transcribe, and encode over 6,000 letters to and from the 20th century French author Marcel Proust. And the reason we're doing this at Illinois is because there are over 1,200 original letters in the University of Illinois Library, which is the largest collection in the world. And just to introduce the two PIs of the project are François Proux, who I think is one of the attendees here today, and Caroline Silovich, and they're both professors at the University of Illinois. And I was hired as the Core Proofs project manager at a point when the PIs were starting to get overwhelmed with their workflow. And luckily, I found Dina Strong as a resource in the university library, and we came up with a list of needs for the project. So first off, the Core Proofs team is not only at Illinois, but also at 2 institutions in France. We are working with a total of 6,000 letters that are going through a 6 to 8 step editorial process. And when I joined the project, the team was using a combination of a Google Sheet and a Box to store files and track their workflow. And so when I joined, I was asked to look through how we could find a centralized location that was reliable, safe, and secure enough for a project with the amount of data, files, and materials we were working with. And so that's when we started with experimenting with different tools. And I think Dina will talk about that.
Hi. So my general approach is to first make sure I really understand the shape of a problem. And after Nick and I had sat down and done a lot of diagramming on a whiteboard, and I was sure that I knew what was going on, we did several small side-by-side trials to see what was the least damage we could do to their infrastructure while still improving the problems that they'd identified as needing solutions. We tried working with Google Sheets. We tried working with Box Skills. We tried using Microsoft Flow. What we discovered was that having something in a Google Sheet just made it too prone to, like, somebody has something selected, they hit the space bar, it's gone. You know, we needed something that had a little bit more structure over that really important metadata of what state every single thing was in. So that was when we started looking at SharePoint. I believe this is Claire?
Yep, this is me. So there's a variety of reasons that SharePoint was an effective solution for us as a content management system. The first is the multilingual interface, as is a collaboration between US and French universities and a multilingual project. Next was the searchable grid view to more easily locate our data. the views by stage of the process, which is particularly useful for managing workflow from the point of view of the project manager and from the RAs doing the transcriptions to see what tasks they have up next. The automatic version control, meaning that SharePoint stores every version of the files we upload, and the integrated storage for transcribers. So I'll say a little more about that with the next slide, because when we started using SharePoint, I was an RA working almost exclusively on transcribing letters. And when you're working on the transcriptions, there are a number of different resources that you need to use, and previously those resources were located in a lot of different places. I mean, some were in Box, some were in Excel sheets, and then there's the question of within the Excel sheets and Box finding the right information that was pertinent to your letter, as well as needing certain other websites, certain files that I needed to have open on my computer. So on the next slide, we have an image now of a sample folder of a letter. So this is now a location where all of the resources that you need to do your transcription are right there for you, right there in front of you in one spot, instead of needing to go hunt through Box and Excel.
So the particular conclusion that this team ended up with is SharePoint, but I don't want to say that SharePoint is the end all be all for everybody. I wanted to show folks the pattern that we used to get here. So the first part of the process is understanding what the shape of all the components that you're working with are, understanding that that screen of 8 different windows in order to know what is coming from where, who is allowed to view it, how you should interact with it, who is allowed to interact with it. Once you have a good understanding of what the starting workflow is and what your pain points are, that's when we move on to step 2, which is figure out who are your available resources, what are your available skill sets, what do you need to accomplish the thing. If you need something that you don't have, what are the workarounds available? One of the reasons I'm a big fan of low-code development is that working with SharePoint, rather than having to have hands on a command line, made us build a system that the Corpus team themselves can continue to refine and develop, because we worked together to build every step of this thing in collaboration with each other. They know what the controls are, and they can hand it off from teammate to teammate as the staff changes. So after you've done the step 1 and the step 2, you know, the step 3 was what we referred to earlier in the trials, was building several little prototypes to get a taste test of this process would work well for us, this process won't work well for us. This person says, okay, I need an emailed reminder. This person says, no, I don't want an emailed reminder. Figuring out what the optimal intersection of the ideal workflow is for your team, your project, and what you need to accomplish. And also taking a look at what resources are out there that may or may not need what you think of as a traditional programming-based type of solution. So that is our last slide. Let's throw it open to the Q&A, folks.
Yeah, we can take questions now. I actually have a question. Well, first.
Actually, I'm going to go back to the previous slide because that's a little bit more helpful than I think.
Than just the open questions.
Just the words questions, yeah, okay.
So I'm glad that you stressed in your tutorial that people should utilize their subject librarians. I often find that people don't know what an amazing resource the library is, and in particular, subject librarians. So I was happy that you mentioned it. So my question is
yeah, Nick told me earlier that, sorry.
No, go ahead, Dina.
Nick told me earlier that it took them like 3 months to get connected up with me. And that's something that, you know, ask the librarians early on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
We knocked on several doors around campus and felt that we weren't going to find a solution to this. And luckily we ended up at the library, and we sort of did a circle and ended up back at the library, which is actually where the main office is for one of our PIs. So funny that we didn't know that it was right next door, but yeah, so glad we found Dina.
Yeah. Well, so my question is, you said that you had documents both in Box and Drive. I know that SharePoint integrates with Microsoft Office. So once you decided to use SharePoint, did you then export all of your Google Sheets and documents into Excel and Word docs? And then did you run into any compatibility issues when doing so? and now are using OneDrive instead of Google Drive and or Box? And how did you manage that transition?
One of the things that we discussed extensively was the need for different access control for different people at different institutions. So the people who are editing the metadata may or may not be the same people who are making contributions. And so having some level of storage still in Box that has email-based upload can allow contributors to send things in that will then be reviewed and checked by the people who are working on the rest of the process. So I believe that we have replaced the Google Sheet with the SharePoint interface for tracking the metadata. And these things that are going through the review process are stored within SharePoint using the OneDrive's version control and SharePoint's ability to roll back. But for raw contribution, which is coming from more locations and different staff, I think that is still happening in Box. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think actually we've switched over entirely to SharePoint.
Okay.
But the transition to that, since the way that the data is formatted in SharePoint is so different than how it was in the Google Sheet and Box, we actually had to transfer that manually, and that took a lot of hours between me, Claire, and another RA to work through that. But we thought it was very important that when we made that transfer, that we do it manually so that we could get it as accurate as possible and make it work the best for our team.
One of the things that we were introducing with SharePoint was some structure on fields that had been preformed. And so if there was like purely structurally, you know, if you had been using data control systems in the Google Doc to begin with, it might have been more automatable.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. Can you talk a little bit? So I know that you said that adopting SharePoint made international collaboration easier, but can you talk a little bit more about what it's like collaborating internationally and across time zones and in different languages?
I think something that's crucial for at least our end of the project is that all of our RAs and PIs are also fluent in French, or even native speakers of French, or people who learned French through their studies. Of course, there are when we have meetings, we have to consider things like the time zone difference. But I think a system like SharePoint actually was helpful in that, because it made tracking workflow so much easier, and that everybody could log into it from their own computer in their own time zone. I mean, even now that we're not meeting in person anymore, it makes it easier to manage a workflow, because the RAs who are doing the transcriptions have a place to go to see what they need to do. Those higher up who are managing the workflow have a way to set out the tasks for the RAs. And so I think in this way, it makes collaboration between different people, especially across countries and across languages, much more efficient.
And also tracking down the latest version of the file is much easier using SharePoint. Before, when we were using a combination of the Google Sheet and Box, sometimes researchers would update Box and forget to update the Google Sheet, or vice versa. And so it would often in the Google Sheet say that one task was done, and then we'd go to Box and try to find that updated file and couldn't. And so tracking that down with someone who wasn't on campus was very difficult. So SharePoint really helped us solve that issue.
Great, let's see.
Guess we can also talk about just meetings in general, and just making sure that we're staying on track. We always are using a Google Doc to organize our meetings and make sure we have a schedule planned out each time. When we first started the project, we weren't doing that, and so we would forget to check off certain tasks, but it's very important to have that list of a checklist of things to do. And I think that's what SharePoint also helps us do, to track all the tasks we're doing and make sure everything is on top of the work.
It sounds like a very robust system. So we have a question here. It sounds like the issues that we're talking about happen after you've already started a project, right? Is it possible to think through all of your needs in advance?
So that's where I'm going to recommend the agile development approach, which is that in my experience, everybody thinks they've thought through everything, and then like the rubber hits the road and you discover that things are not entirely as you planned. And so the small rapid prototype, the low code approach both work very well with small incremental changes and adaptive responses to things that you discover along the way. We spent a couple of months refining this process as we tested it out small scale as it scaled up. Another thing that I can bring over from my IT background is up to a certain point, while we were still in draft mode, we felt fairly comfortable experimenting with the one copy of it. Once it became the production system and lots of people were using it, we asked our tech folks to make a backup copy of the SharePoint system for us to make infrastructure changes to the SharePoint system in a test location that wouldn't be affecting the live production system, and work out what those changes were before we considered moving them to live.
Maybe just to follow up on that, like from the perspective in RA, this is really reiterating what Dina was saying, but that our needs are constantly changing, actually. Like when we take on new tasks, new challenges, and the project develops, we have changed needs. So I mean, even if, I don't think there's just the point before the project when we started and we were already into the project when we knew all of the needs at one moment, because the needs are constantly changing. And what's been helpful about SharePoint, we've been able to modify it to suit our needs as we've gone on.
Okay, another question. Do you have a link to the Agile method to share out for those of us who are not familiar with this method?
Is it okay if I dig that up when I'm not sharing my screen and send it a little bit later?
Sure, yeah, we'll send that in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Great. Any other questions? We have
like the
one more
nutshell
minute.
version of Agile is, instead of like making buckets of documentation and pre-planning and laying everything out in advance, you sort of, if you've heard of a Kanban board, if you've heard of Trello or Microsoft Planner, you have like small itemized tasks and you decide these are going to be the top priority, and you work on just those top priority things and test it out. It's like the difference between baking small batches of cupcakes and going for the wedding cake all at once. You will get more food out the door over time with the cupcake method, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, you guys. That was a wonderful tutorial that you put together, and a great Q&A and presentation also. Thanks so much to all our presenters so far. This has been great.
So I'm going to do just a quick introduction for this third session here. So this session is on commonly used digital humanities tools. So we have 3 tutorials for this session. Our first presenter is Adrienne R. Hall. Adrienne is a PhD student in geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she's a lab instructor for GIS. And she created a tutorial called Intro to Digital Cartography. Our second tutorial for the session comes from Kelly O'Neill, director of the Imperia project at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Kelly's tutorial is called Bend But Don't Break: How to Get Apps to Play Nicely Together and Preserve Your Own Sanity. And then the third tutorial in the session is Twinery.org, Building Literary Hypertext from Megan Parham. And Megan is a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. So I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. So I'm Adrienne, and as Janet said, I'm a second-year PhD student in geography at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm also a lab instructor for GIS, but my work is actually around critical public health. So I'm sort of got into mapping a little bit unconventionally. So I've been a long-term member of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a critical cartography and digital storytelling collective. And that's where I first got started making amateur maps. And so my tutorial is really to share some skills that I've learned working as the lab instructor for GIS, and also, some tips that I taught myself using ArcGIS Online to help you get started making maps. So my tutorial begins with just to get everyone acclimated to the different concepts and terms around geographic information, because that will be helpful, not only for going through the technical sessions, but also then you could actually sort of search the other tutorials out there to help you along. So the first portion is around getting you used to the terms and concepts in geographic information. And the main portion of the tutorial uses QGIS, and QGIS is an open source, freely available geographic information software. And the thing that's nice about QGIS is that it can run on both a Mac or a PC, so you're not limited in terms of subscription or the type of computer that you're using. And so through the tutorial, you'll actually make 3 different maps, and you have the data sets there with you. And then for the final portion, you'll actually make a web-based map using ArcGIS Online. So ArcGIS Online is a web-based, sort of browser-based mapping software that allows you to create interactive web maps. But it does have a limitation in that you can't export a high resolution image of your map. So my hope is that you can work with both QGIS, even if you just want to design interactive web maps, to allow more to allow you to make more customized maps and give you more flexibility in working with whichever software you decide. So.
Thank you. And for folks who haven't had a chance to watch the tutorial yet, it's very comprehensive. Like you said, the data sets are there and available for you to follow along and everything. So let's open it up to questions. And while we wait for this Q&A to come in, I had a question for you. So I know there's a lot of interest here at UIC in GIS with like humanities researchers working with maps. And so I was just curious if you want to talk a little bit about your work with the Anti-Eviction Project, or any of your like current projects. Like, is there something that you've discovered through mapping that's been surprising or shocking?
Yeah, thank you. So actually some of the maps in the example are maps that I did for the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. We're actually coming out with an atlas of Bay Area displacement and resistance. So we're coming out with a book actually at the end of this year that features different maps that we've made to tell the story about displacement and resistance in the San Francisco Bay Area region. And some of those involve health and environmental justice, and others of them are sort of loss of population. So I think the thing that I've learned about maps is about storytelling. So I think for some people are very interested in sort of the technical data visualizations, but I think broadly about maps is telling a story. And something I've actually gotten into recently is more of creative cartography. So I might start off just making a map in a GIS software, but then thinking about how I can sort of play around with geographic concepts like projection. What about seeing the world from, the global south, and not sort of the same sort of centered on the US or things that we see. So I really, I think knowing the technical side has helped me actually branch more out into sort of creative cartographies and things like that. So yeah, I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thanks. And actually, so in your tutorial, you talk about both digital maps and like physical printed, high quality maps. And I'm curious, like, what are the scenarios where you'd want one over the other? Like, what's the value of having that atlas you described and having like a physical copy?
Yeah, so I first got started making story maps using ArcGIS Online. And so you can do a lot of things in terms of integrating photos and hyperlinking text and just making a really compelling story where if you want people to sort of interact with the thing that you're plotting. And so, for example, one of the examples is we have a number of oral histories about people experiencing evictions. And so we actually plotted some of those stories over a map of where evictions are happening, but also you can click and hear the audio of someone's, so sort of humanizing the story of displacement. And so actually at the same time I was doing my master's in public health, and I just got really into mapping. And so I was making a map of the study area, but I couldn't just have a PNG file of a map to put into my thesis. So then I realized there's like a limit of, you know, do you need the interactivity, or are you just trying to tell sort of a more simple story that's, you know, locating people? Is it a reference map? Is it a thematic map? You know, you sort of have to decide, is the interactivity even necessary, or does it even distract from the story you're trying to tell? So that's when I started thinking about, you know, more whether I needed interactivity. And actually I was faced with a real problem of I needed to just put the image of the map in my thesis, and I couldn't screenshot it. So then with QGIS, you can sort of create a map and then export it as a higher resolution image. And, you know, there's things that you have to consider with what you're representing, whether you're doing an interactive map or sort of a two-dimensional map. So, I mean, I think it's just helped me think more about representation and what maps are representing. So if you have some temporal component, you know, you sort of have to think about how do you show over time if it's in a printed book, whereas online you might be able to show that more interactively. So it's just things that I continue to think about more as I'm faced with challenges.
Thanks. So we do have a question here. So it says, congratulations and thanks for the presentation. It is powerful how you connect maps with the story. What is the biggest challenge in telling the story through maps, especially if maps are not readily available for all communities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the challenging things is as you learn more of the techniques and the technologies, you realize the disconnect between the way people sort of interpret or understand them. So I could have all kinds of colors and dot sizes, but my audience might not know what I'm trying to tell them. So I think one challenge is just, there's so many ways that you could add many layers and interactivity, but, you know, if I can just focus on the story that I'm trying to tell and whether I need the map in the first place, I think that's one thing that I think about. But also, I feel a little bit sort of restricted in the era of like Google Maps and everything being on a particular grid, when sometimes things can be geographic that are relational. So it might be, how do these two places relate to one another, or what, that might not necessarily be something that you plot on sort of a grid. So that's where creative cartographies, I think, come in. And I've been able to do some work with collage workers. So sort of starting maybe with an idea using sort of this technical GIS, but then thinking about another way of representing that story that might be a little bit more compelling. And so I found that, you know, other visual artists are really good at doing that with collage work and muralists and things like that. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Great. Okay, just a comment here that someone says that they love that you say that the map may not be necessary. So you're not assuming that mapping is the answer necessarily. I was curious with the anti-eviction project, and you said you are creating, the group's creating a physical version of those maps. Do those get shared somehow with, like, say, the people who contributed to the project, who did the who contributed some way with actually talking about their eviction?
Yeah, so thank you. Well, so the anti-eviction mapping project sort of emerged out of housing justice organizers in the Bay Area wanting to counter some of the narratives were coming out about gentrification and whether evictions were happening in 2013. So the first map that was made was sort of made for housing justice organizers to tell the story about evictions and displacement. And then most of the maps sort of live online on the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project webpage, but for the Atlas, we actually have hundreds of contributions. We sought contributions from artists, sort of poets, essayists, muralists. So it's really a community, a collaborative project. And so I think to answer your question is so some of the maps were sort of specifically made for a particular community who needed those maps to, counter evictions. And the Atlas is really sort of a anti-eviction mapping project and friends kind of collaborative project that, contributors definitely get a copy of the Atlas, but we also have most of the maps online. I feel like I might not be answering the question in the best way, but I guess this book is our way of sharing it even broader outside of those networks in the Bay Area.
Yeah. I'm actually so one of the first projects that I ever worked on as a in a librarian setting was it was a collection at DePaul University in Chicago for this group called that was founded by Gail Sincata, and this just reminds me of it because so much of the archives were maps. She did redlining work, basically trying to stop redlining in Chicago, and essentially the maps were there to prove that redlining was happening, and it eventually became policy. They used it to draft policy, which then became law eventually. So I'm just curious if your work with maps, have you seen either in the public health setting or the anti-eviction work where people are actually using these maps to shape policy?
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of so the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is one of the many members of the San Francisco Anti-Displacement Coalition and the sort of local San Francisco Bay Area regional coalitions, but also statewide coalitions. So there have been a number of campaigns for housing justice laws where those maps have been used to support, statewide campaigns for housing. So I'm not the best person to tell you what particular wins, but definitely a lot of it's a collective. So a lot of people produce maps for that purpose, but actually we just did a map about sort of some of the eviction moratoriums that are happening during COVID and mapping some of those protections, areas where there's no protections, and then also areas where there's rent strikes. So that's another example of sort of locating, and that map started as just a US map, but it actually is now a global map of sort of making the connections between housing justice struggles globally. And I guess link this, so we have this sort of COVID housing justice tracking map that, just because we have people who are technical in programming and mapping and researching these different policies, it's really an amazing sort of thing that comes together.
Yeah, if you want to share the links, you don't have to share them right this second, but in the chat, I'm sure people would be interested in seeing that. Let's see here. Do you think, so the two tools that you showed, is that kind of where you started with mapping, or did you try out some other things first and discovered those, or because I'm sure a lot of people, especially in this workshop, have like no experience at all with using GIS tools.
Yeah, so I actually started with ArcGIS Online, making web maps, because my university for my master's actually had, you can sign in through your university account, and that gave me access. Otherwise, sort of ArcGIS, sort of desktop software is, you have to pay for it, and I actually couldn't run it because I have a Mac. So ArcGIS was really useful in that it has so many data sets that it's very user friendly if you're sort of beginning. So I think it's a good starting place, but quickly, if you want to make maps with your own data, I think it takes a little bit more skill. And that's why I start with QGIS, because, if you know more about how the software works, some of the terms and types of data that you need, then you can bring in or even create your own data sets that are not just sort of the pre-populated ones in ArcGIS Online. I will say that there's a beta version of ArcGIS Online that I didn't want to go into on the tutorial, but it does allow you to, I think, save image, which wasn't a feature that possible before. But so I started with ArcGIS Online, and there's other tools like CartoDB and Mapbox. There's other web mapping software there, but I felt like ArcGIS Online gives you, it's the most user-friendly, I think, and it gives you a good amount of storage, whereas you might run into subscription issues. And then QGIS is just, it's free, it's openly available, it runs on any computer, and you can just sort of be more knowledgeable about and be more intentional about what you're creating, whereas ArcGIS Online is a little bit less flexible.
So I do have a question here from the chat. Would love to know how Adrienne deals with ambiguities and uncertainties in data in her map work.
Yeah, I think I try to do the tutorial as where I was when I was sort of just beginning to map. And I had this idea of like, if I have a spreadsheet that has all the, zip codes or all the census tracts, I should be able to just dump this into a software and it'll map those values. But so I think I had to really understand sort of how geographic information works and what, so I needed to know a little bit more conceptually about how maps represent the world, whether it be projections, whether it be the things that you can map or things that just don't have any, no spatial sort of reference to map, or how you can add that element. But in terms of ambiguity, I mean, I think I'm sort of a critical cartographer. So I think that maps are a representation, and there's always, there's a lot embedded within that. So I have now, how do I say this? So I think definitely you have to understand the data that you're working with, and because you could represent it in a completely different fashion that may be completely misleading. So, I mean, I think it's helpful to know that maps can be misleading, and I try to think about them as, what story am I trying to tell, and how can I represent the story with, as much accuracy and integrity as possible. And that might be someone's own narrative about their experience with a place, or it could be, census data, and how can I most accurately represent that? And that might involve understanding more about those elements that I'm trying to map, rather than just focusing on the end result of the map. I hope that answers the question, but yeah, I think that's just something I constantly think about, is maps are a representation, and how can I represent the story I'm trying to tell with as much integrity and accuracy as I can.
Thank you. And I have another question here. Do you offer map help services to other humanists? Lou Turner is working on the Hal Barron project and the history of and the history of segregation in Chicago. And he has some amazing maps. If you don't offer map services to others, do you know anyone who might?
Okay, I'm not sure I know what is meant by map services. Can I guess I'd say I teach students, undergraduate students in my intro to geography classes, but we do organize sort of skill sharing sessions. We've done that in the past through the Anti-Eviction Mapping Collective, and I always sort of one-on-one, but I don't have a service of doing that right now. But I have recently been involved with working with some historians who are writing an essay, and I helped make a map for them. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that question. I don't have any map services other than teaching and formal skill shares.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I know there are some libraries that are hiring like GIS specialists now to do, I think what this person's asking about, which is basically consult with people who maybe have never worked with maps before and need some help getting started. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, I know my university has a GIS specialist who has been very helpful, and I would look for similar resources at the institution that you're at.
Great. Thank you so much for your tutorial. I've already seen people asking about getting the links again so they can watch it again, so they can refer to it later, because it's very comprehensive. So that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our second presentation now is Bend But Don't Break, How to Get Apps to Play Nicely Together and Preserve Your Own Sanity. So welcome, Kelly O'Neill. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be part of this. So thanks to the Digital Humanities Initiative and to all of you for being here. And thank you to everyone who has presented so far. I have really, really enjoyed listening to the presentations and watching the tutorials. And I have just thoroughly enjoyed the fact that one of the through lines throughout this entire conversation has been the question posed in the morning session: how do you create meaningful and respectful data, right? And that idea of the respectful data and the integrity of the data and the integrity of the project, it's just such an important question. So I've really, really appreciated the reminder of that. I'm Kelly O'Neill. I am also grateful to Adrienne because she was the one who did the GIS stuff, because usually that's my thing. I'm a historical GIS person, and it was really, really fun to take on a different role for this workshop. I work on the history of the Russian Empire, and the project that I run is called the Imperia Project, and it's located at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. We're funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we are doing all kinds of things that I consider to be fun and hopefully eventually productive, that sit kind of on the cusp of traditional and more experimental methods in terms of humanities work and digital humanities work, and applying machine learning to beautiful old historical maps from the early 19th century and all kinds of things. But what I did the tutorial about for these things, these maps, these cards, I based my tutorial is about a set of playing cards, like these things that we can touch and see, and they're held at the Library of Congress, and they were produced in the 19th century, and there's one playing card for every province of the Russian Empire, and they are incredible troves of information. They have an incredible amount of visual and quantitative information about the empire, about who lived where, what the economic activities were, what the geographical features were, soil quality, all kinds of things. And when you teach history to undergraduates, primarily, I teach graduate students as well, but lots of undergrads, when you see something that's this pretty and this kind of systematic, you think, oh my gosh, what a great teaching tool. So what do you do with it? How can I convert something that is really just an image file, right, into something that is both accessible and usable? And that's the other idea that's been cropping up again today, is the idea of producing something. What does digital humanities work? What is your product, right? What are you producing? What are you trying to build? And I really love that about digital humanities work, the idea that we're building things. And in my mind, the best kind of thing to build is the kind of thing that other people can use to build other things, right? So that's my ideal product. So my ideal product in this case was to take this wealth of information contained in this totally quirky and unique kind of visual resource, convert it into something that would be usable to undergrads who don't read Russian, and make it not just kind of readable, but something that they could start using to pose questions, start thinking about research programs, and do some critical work comparing different regions of a gigantic, really interesting empire. So that's what I was trying to do. And the tutorial, what it does is kind of walks you through the process that I think, so my material is super specific, but the process that I tried to describe is one that I think that is very, very common among digital humanists. The idea that you have this general idea of what you want to build, and you're not entirely sure how to do it, and you think you know which tool to use, so you start with one tool, and then you realize that you've maxed out its capacity, or it can't quite do exactly what you want. And then you think, well, do I try to break that tool, or do I kind of just bend it far enough and merge it with something else? And it's not necessarily always the ideal practice, but I think it's pretty common, and it's what I tried to describe. So the tutorial talks about how I started by bringing this set of images as a collection into a Mecca, which is a really commonly used kind of content management system that really focuses on, can hold anything, it has great metadata, it enables you to do interesting things with material. I brought it in there, did some things with it, realized that that wasn't going to be enough, and started looking elsewhere. And so then I talk about using Scalar and using Tableau. And Scalar is a digital publishing platform, both of which, both Omeka and Scalar are open source. So there are things you don't have to pay for in order to use. Scalar does totally different things with very similar kinds of materials. So it's kind of like a bit of a Venn diagram of, Omeka does a few things really well, certain things less well, and Scalar picks up on the other end and does certain things well and other things less well. But it is basically a tool for publishing in a digital format. So it's very friendly to creating text and context and links between things. And as a historian, that really, really appeals to me, the ability to kind of build pieces of content together and provide a kind of scholarly scaffolding around them. And the last piece of it is that, it's the other side of my brain, the one that is totally in love with data and, analysis, and wanting to be able to, at the very least, allow students to kind of interact, get right to that primary information without any interface, well, without much interface on my part, allow them to dive right into the data contained in a set of playing cards, basically, and learn about the empire from a set of playing cards. And to do that, I needed some sort of data visualization tool. And Scalar does a couple of things natively in terms of visualization, but not very much. Tableau is this other product that has a public, totally free version, and anyone who teaches or is a student and has an email associated with an educational institution can get a free license, which is awesome. And they provide great, great support for their product. But it otherwise is a licensed kind of product. But it is a great kind of data visualization tool. It does lots of things really well in terms of data visualization, and doesn't do things well in terms of being able to narrate and contextualize and explain. So basically the tutorial is about, how to try to kind of get all of these things to play nicely together. And so that no one who uses the product that I built necessarily knows that they're using a product that is at the same time drawing on 3 different apps or tools, to try to make that into a seamless experience for the user. to pull that off without going completely insane myself. So that was the idea of the tutorial. So I didn't get into the nuts and bolts of how to do any of it. It was really kind of a thought process, because I think that that project design, the experience of going through the process of designing your project and then redesigning and redesigning as you're moving through it, it's actually one of the most gratifying, frustrating / gratifying pieces of digital humanities work, or humanities work in general. But my belief is that there's always a solution. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have about that.
Great, thank you. So we'll open it up now to the Q&A for folks who joined more recently. If you could ask in the Q&A and not the comments, that would be great. But I have a question for you, which is funny you mentioned just now the seamless aspect, because that's the one thing that I noticed. One of the things that I noticed, since I am the digital publishing librarian,
yeah.
and I've used both Omeka and Scalar a lot. Like, I thought you did a really great job of, it does look like it's all on one platform. It doesn't, you can't tell that you're actually looking at 3 different systems at the same time. So can you talk about, like, at what point in the bending process do you realize that you actually like need a different tool, and that like and it's not going to work, the one that you're currently using?
Yeah. So for me, I guess I'll try to answer really briefly for the 2 kind of crucial moments in this particular project, right? You tend to know that you're bending and about to break a tool or your own project, right? When you start feeling, I think, the frustration level starts getting really high. Like, I start contenting. I know when I'm at that point, because I start sending a flurry of emails to all of the people in the library who help support my work. And I realize, oh my God, they're going to start hating me, because I'm pushing and pushing and pushing and asking for so many things. And they're saying, Kelly, it's a great idea, and we'd love to add that to our list of things to do. Well, maybe, we'll get around to it when we can. But I don't know when that's going to happen. And then you know that you're asking a little bit too much of the tool. So, with Omeka, what I said in the tutorial, Omeka has incredible capacity to create an interactive experience with visual material through one of its plugins. And I absolutely love Neatline is the plugin I'm talking about. I love using it for maps, and I use it with my students. But one of the things I wanted to be able to do, and this is, it's kind of an idea I talk about in the tutorial, but it's a little bit slippery, especially kind of at the beginning of the level when you're putting a project together. I was thinking, if I'm going to explain something on an image, right? If I'm going to explain what something is, I'm going to go to that trouble and I'm going to share my expertise about it. I want that annotation, that bit of writing, to be treated as a thing that stands on its own within the project and isn't just a sticky note attached to something important, right? The idea that my work is important too, the thing that I've added to the project. And in the Omeka Neatline system, an annotation that you create doesn't have that standing. So philosophically for me, this was like one of those bending, breaking points. And so I moved to Scalar because Scalar does allow me to do that. And I pay a price because the annotation ability in Scalar isn't as beautiful. So there's definitely, bending and breaking means you're definitely bending, right? You're going to have to let go of certain things. And I think that's an important part. Compromise is really, really important. But you feel that moment in any number of ways. It's either because you feel like your principles are getting compromised, or you're just becoming too annoying to the people that you're working with, and you have to make some sort of adjustment. And on the data visualization side, there are just incredible things. I think the other thing I would say in answer to your question is, I think one can become in love with one's tool very easily, right? And so a tool that is incredibly powerful, like Tableau or ArcGIS Online and story maps, they're incredible. You can do incredible things with them. And I think you start developing this kind of obsession with, oh, well, it will allow me to do this, and so I should do that thing, right? And then you realize, oh, but wait a minute, doing that thing doesn't actually advance my own interest or the interests of my project. I need to kind of scale back a little bit. And, you know, and Tableau is the kind of thing, it's just, you can put an incredible amount of work into developing the data visualization, you know, capacity of your data. But it isn't always, as you know, it isn't always the right thing to do for your project. So there's that moment of, you know, needing to rein it back in.
Thank you. So we have a question here in the Q&A. Did you learn these things about Tableau, for example, through experimentation, or do you consult with people on what's best for the kind of work you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great question. So I generally am a little bit pig-headed, and I tend to not want to ask for help, and I insist on trying to figure things out on my own, which is not something that I would recommend doing, but if we're being honest, right? So I basically have learned a lot through trial and error. I have learned a lot about data visualization software, GIS, lots of things. And eventually, it probably took me about 5 or 6 years to really realize that I would be much better served by, you know, by harassing the librarians and the data scientists and the GIS people. I actually learned to harass pretty quickly, but at trial and error. And I'm saying that in a very critical way, but it's also true that I do think one of the best ways to learn is through a little bit of trial and error on your own. People who are particularly who are a specialist of a particular kind, know their software, know how to code, know their tools really well, but aren't as in tune with your particular data and its idiosyncrasies or your own goals. And I do think that any digital humanist, no matter what their facility with like on the technological side, becomes a better digital humanist by doing enough messing around to be able to at least talk the talk, right? And know how to be a good collaborator with someone who has an expertise in a different area. So I shouldn't have been as pig-headed as I was for a very long time. And yet I did benefit because I think I've probably become I have a better sense of what it is I'm trying to accomplish. In my defense, I have taken lots of non-credit, you know, trainings and classes over the years, but I've also been at it for a long time.
Yeah, I think that actually goes along with some discussion in the second session where we talked about like prototyping things.
Yeah.
And I think I've found for people that having them just try the tool, try one little part of their project and see if it works is really helpful.
It is, yeah. And it's something that I think doesn't necessarily come so naturally to those of us who are in the humanities and software social sciences. It's just not part of our research practice, right? We have a research question and we go to an archive and we immerse ourselves in the archive and we go, right, with the project. And the idea of piloting something, of testing something in that initial phase, at least, you know, it was never part of my training as a historian. And I think it's a very valuable thing to add to your wheelhouse, no matter what discipline, you know, you primarily practice in. I absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
Great. So I have another question here, which is, could you talk a little bit about the Imperia project overall, how it grew over time, how you incorporate different sub-projects within the project overall, and how you manage the team?
Okay, so it grew out. It was kind of a secondary part of my work when I was on faculty in the history department, and then for a while, for probably about 6 or 7 years, and I always had a small team of research assistants working with me. School just got out, so we have a couple of second graders in the background. And then 2 years ago, it became my full-time job, and I have a bigger team working around me now. So I have undergraduates and graduate students and collaborators in different fields at Harvard. The idea of the project, basically, is to create a spatial history of the Russian Empire. It is a GIS project, so it's primarily focused on spatial questions and spatial relations. And the idea is that this project should or could be interesting to anyone who works on anything having to do with an empire or anything historical, because so many of the methodological issues that we deal with are common across historical GIS projects. So we spend a lot of our time working on figuring out, answering questions that begin with the word where, locating historical places, thinking about what it means to locate a historical place, how you assign a coordinate location to a place that maybe doesn't exist anymore or has changed over time, kind of thorny, kind of gazetteer type issues like that. So there's a lot of that kind of bedrock, kind of building the data foundation for doing spatial analysis. We do the second part of our work, the second kind of pillar is on experimenting with technologies that can automate or kind of fully automate the production of information. So how do you use a computer to read a historical map and generate all kinds of information? And so that's kind of the techie part of it. And the third part of the project, the final pillar, is to experiment with genre and to ask the question, what should spatial history look like? What is a spatial history? You know, Adrian talked about that question about static versus interactive map. That's part of it, right? But a spatial history integrates not just maps, but context. There's text and all kinds of things. And how much power do you want to turn over to the consumer, and how much hand-holding do you want to do, and how should this be delivered, and in what increment? You know, should it be bite-sized morsels or kind of dinner plate-sized, you know, helpings of historical information? So a third pillar of the project is really to try to experiment with a lot of that and try to figure out how to deliver spatial history in a way that gets people excited about it. And how do I manage? Well, managing people has gotten so hard during coronavirus, during the pandemic. Everything has just gotten really hard. I feel like I was pretty good at it, but when we could all get together and we'd have 8 people sitting around a table every other week, and we'd share and we'd kind of work through problems that were cropping up and felt like we were a team. And all of that has become a lot harder. I think I've become a bad manager ever since the pandemic. And that's one of the things that I've kind of set as a goal for myself, is how to do that a little bit more effectively now, given all of the different kind of responsibilities that are on everybody's shoulders right now, and not, you know, everyone's. But what I do love about managing a team is that everyone brings something different to the table, and it is fantastic to watch an undergraduate who doesn't speak Russian but has a background in computer science or GIS, work side by side with a PhD student or someone from the grad school of design who has years and years of data visualization experience, or someone who speaks Russian, and they find a common language. And that's a really important part of the project, is developing a community of people who can work together. So it's on me to figure out a better way to manage myself, maybe. I guess that's the problem now.
I think everyone gets some slack for management right now. Time management, people management. Okay, so we're at the time now. We will be switching over now to our third person. So thank you so much, Kelly. And I'm biased because I'm in digital publishing, so I love both Omeka and Scalar. So I loved seeing them integrated together like that. And then our next presentation is on twinery.org, building literary hypertexts. And this is Megan Parham, PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. So welcome, Megan.
Hi, thanks so much. So I have to apologize because my normally very sleepy dog is just going wild right now. So if you hear some noises in the background, that's what it is. But yeah, so thank you so much for the introduction. I'm excited to be here, and thank you for having me. So I'm Megan. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Alberta. That's in Canada. And it's almost going to start snowing here, so it's very cold. And yeah, so I'm working with a tool called Twine. If you're not familiar with it, I'm going to talk about that today. And So my tutorial was focused on the sort of capabilities of this literary hypertext tool. And my tutorial was called twinery.org, Building Literary Hypertext. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of my key points. So we can start with what literary hypertext is. So it's a form of digital story writing that calls on the reader to participate in the narrative's sort of unfolding by selecting various hyperlink options that branch the narrative into nonlinear directions. And so what I found is that a lot of the scholarly work on literary hypertext is really concentrated in the discipline of game studies and also digital humanities. And its primary function is, it's typically been looking at how to use it as a tool to make digital fictions. So digital fictions are literary story games that use hyperlinks to create a sort of choose your own adventure style experience for the reader, or the reader player, they're sometimes referred to. So Twine is one platform for creating literary hypertext, and it's freely accessible. It's an open source tool, and it was developed by interactive fiction author Chris Klimas in 2009. And his intention was to reduce barriers to entry for game creators of marginalized identities. So Twine has really come to be described by scholars, and my supervisor, Astrid Enslin, is one of the leaders in the field on this topic. And she's referred to it as predominantly a queer and women-dominated community. And I think Twine has really cultivated a movement of support from marginalized game developers who are often excluded from the very masculinist white spaces of hypertext development. And this is ultimately because Twine is a culture of free production and distribution. So like I said, it's free to download, it's open source, and it exports stories as HTML files, and then the authors can publish them online for free on websites like itch.io. And it's also really easy to use. So there's no coding knowledge required by the author, but it does utilize, variables like or conditional logic, images, CSS, JavaScript. So those are for the more experienced authors. And these elements, they allow for integration of sound and images and interactive components, which is really the main feature of Twine, is the interactivity. And so beyond the, I guess, technological and financial access, Twine and literary hypertext as a whole really just subverts these assumed norms in typical story writing, because it promotes experimentation, I guess, through multiple endings or a branching plot or these very interactive components with the reader player. So individuals playing the game or reading the story, they can experience the story differently, and they can play out different endings or different narrative paths than someone else who's maybe playing the same game. And I think the unique capability of writing stories in Twine is essentially twofold. So it comes down to interactivity for the reader, and also branching plot lines. Although I'll stress that not all stories or games made in Twine actually utilize these features, but a lot of them do. So back to my tutorial. In my tutorial, I showcased how you can add interactive elements into your story, like having the reader player insert their name and then having that data populate other parts of the story. And then I also showed how you can create branching storylines that rely on the reader player choosing different hyperlink options. And yeah, so literary hypertext is ultimately rhizomatic. So it can be used to imagine alternative plot lines and offer multiple endings, like I said. And essentially it's about choice for the reader. So where are they going to click, right? And then in my tutorial, I discussed 3 main structural paths that Twine stories can take. So in terms of story structure, we can break it down into 3 paths. The first one is a forward path. So the story moves the author through a sort of straight line. And the intention of a forward path is that, you know, every reader or player has the exact same experience with the story as someone else. And then you can also have a weaving path. So the story branches out with different hypertext passages, but it ultimately comes back to a single path. And the purpose of a weaving path could be to, you know, create this illusion of choice for the reader, but ultimately still holding on to control of the story as the author. And then finally, the third structural path would be multiple paths. So the story has different paths for the reader to follow. So each path could have a different plot and possibly a different ending to the story. Multiple paths, or they're more complex to make, and they take a little bit more time, but they really come to be understood as the sort of heart of literary hypertext. So the purpose of multiple paths is to offer agency to the reader. So yeah, in my tutorial, I offered a quick look on how to actually use Twine if you're not familiar with the tool. And then I discussed 3 different potential uses for Twine. So its most typical use, which is in the creation of digital fiction games. And then I talked about it as an education tool for mind mapping. And then finally, I talked about it, how I'm using it in my dissertation research, which is as a therapy tool for writing illness narratives, and particularly for women with hyperandrogenism. Yeah, that's it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. So we'll move on to question and answer. So if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen there. I had a question for you about the thing you just mentioned last, your dissertation actually, which is, so I was intrigued by the reader versus player dynamic, or reader-player dynamic that you described, and you talked about like using it as a therapeutic way for the writers, right? But I'm curious, like, what do you think are the benefits for the readers who interact with that, with the tool?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm working on another project right now called Writing New Bodies, and we're actually building a digital fiction to be used for young women and non-binary people to deal with body image concerns. So that experience and the literature we're sort of working with there is really about the reading experience or the playing experience. So how do we make a tool that could work in a therapy session, or you know, we're actually looking at integrating it with the Girl Guides in our local community. So things like that. So that's really, it's, I think, more difficult in some ways because you have to think about something that's inclusive for everyone who's going to play it, and that's almost impossible to do. So a lot of that comes down to having like components that the reader can insert into it so that they can see themselves represented. So that's a big part of having it as a therapy tool if you're going to read it or play it. The work that I'm doing in my dissertation kind of flips the script on that. So I'm less interested in reading digital fiction or reading literary hypertext as a therapy tool. I'm more interested in the writing process. So I started my interest in illness narratives as a therapy tool. So typically looking at them as written memoir. But then I kind of recognized the lack of access there for a lot of groups of people, right, that don't have access to publishing and things like that. And then I got more interested in the online space and digital components that allow for free publishing online. So in that sense, as a therapy tool for illness narratives, it's really about the writing process for these women, and less about the reading. So you can kind of use it both ways, and they work in different ways.
Cool, thanks. So I have a question here. To what extent has hypertext/Twine been used for non-fictional purposes? I think you just got to this a bit with the illness narratives comment. I'm asking because so often hypertext fiction does seem obviously doesn't seem obviously to connect more broadly to digital humanities methods, but I don't see why hypertext couldn't connect with the critical methods and theories of humanities.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something that's really coming up in my research right now, that there isn't actually a lot of use in nonfiction purposes for literary hypertext that I'm finding, especially for tools like Twine that are used for making digital games and things like that. So I'm really looking at this kind of dynamic between fiction and nonfiction and how that's different. And I'm very interested in using it as a tool to write nonfiction illness narratives. So what the difference I'm kind of seeing is really interesting, because I'm just having participants working now, so I'm getting some stories coming in. But when it's being used as a digital fiction tool, we have, you know, these different elements of storytelling, fictional worlds, imagining new spaces, all these very cool things. With nonfiction, what I'm finding is that the participants are kind of integrating like the structure that they see online for like Wikipedia and things like that. So more informational. So they'll be telling their story. I have one participant who's writing right now, and she starts and she goes over all of her symptoms that she's dealing with, and she's hyperlinked to every symptom that she has. And then you click on the symptom, and then she gives a very like medical definition of what that symptom is. So when you're reading her story, you're also getting like information on it in a very nonfiction way. This is very interesting. So I think they're really pulling together the more storytelling aspects with informative purposes. So it's really cool.
Okay, and I have another question here. So this is, I know someone with BDD. Is there a link to your project about body image? So is that something that you have out there available for people to look at?
Yes, absolutely. So we're just coming on the tail end. We're funded by SSHRC, which is our federal funding agency in Canada. So we're working with a digital fiction artist from the UK who has amazing work. I can also link to her. Her name is Christine Wilkes, and she's building the digital fiction right now. And she's really working with these concepts of growing outside of the mold. So she's working with images, and it's kind of like the image is like a breathing, morphing kind of orifice, and then within a binary or a box or a boundary that could actually be the screen of your phone if you're playing on your phone, or the screen of your computer if you're playing there. And then the reader player is taken through various choices, and they make choices, and each time they break out of these kind of normalized ideals that we're constrained to, the image kind of grows outside of the boundaries. So that's kind of the image that she's working with. And we're going to launch that hopefully in the next month or two. And I can link to that when we have our digital launch, if you're interested.
So where would we find that information about it? Like, will there be a general announcement, or?
Yeah, so I can put it on our listserv, that the digital humanities one that I think this is on, and our website is Writing New Bodies. Okay. So you can visit that as well.
Great. Let's see if there's any other questions. I'm curious if you've used other tools, like I know Scalar has some of that path capability where you can create different paths for people to navigate content. I'm curious if there are other like hypertext tools that you've experimented with.
Yeah, I'm kind of starting to now to really gauge or to justify why I chose Twine over something else. But it was really coming down to how user-friendly it was. And the participants are really enjoying getting to learn the new tool. And that was kind of the biggest comment that came out of our Writing New Bodies project. We had participants in our workshops build their own stories in Twine, and then we took their stories and kind of integrated it into this larger comprehensive game. But it was really about writing their own story that they found most enjoyable, and they loved Twine. So that's kind of why I chose to work with it for my own dissertation. But I'm starting to look at different tools now, and there's a lot out there. So, and it's just getting more diverse, I think.
Great, thanks. Well, so I think we can wrap it up for today, and then I want to thank everybody who joined us, especially in this last session here, and for both your tutorials and your answering the questions today and presenting for us. So I'll turn it over to Carla, because I think you had a few things you wanted to say, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today. This wraps up the UIC DHI Fall 2020 workshop. Deepest gratitude to all our presenters and to all of you for joining us today. Just a reminder that the video tutorials will be available on the private YouTube channel indefinitely. I know we've got some chat comments, people who were concerned about that. But access to the additional files for Intro to Digital Cartography and the slideshows will expire today at 7 p.m. CST. So please download them now if you wish to utilize them in the future. And I guess if you missed the deadline, Adrian, is it okay if I send people directly to you for those files in the future, or how you can let me know later how you want to handle that? Please check our website, dhi.uic.edu, for upcoming events and announcements. If you have questions or comments about today's event, please find our contact information for both me and Janet on the DHI website. We'd love some feedback. And we wish you success on all your digital humanity projects and a great afternoon. So thanks, everyone.
Quick question. Are you saying that we need to download the YouTube files to watch them later?
No, just the additional files. There were some additional files for the exercises that Adrian had in her tutorial, and a couple of companion PowerPoint presentations. Those are the ones that will expire today at 7. The video tutorials themselves will remain available.
Okay, thank you.
All right, everyone, have a great day.